Well, the good news is that there's increased sort of like decentralization of what constitutes the art world, right? Principally in the past, this revolves around Paris, London, and New York. These locales can no longer claim any form of dominance or centrality. And that's a good thing, because different kinds of knowledge systems, different ways of expressing oneself, different kinds of cultural norms do sort of like contribute to the enrichment and the diversity that we see in contemporary art today, and the kind of discourse that goes on, right? The bad news about this is that it tends to encourage, even as it sort of decentralizes, it tends to sort of like encourage a very cookie cutter sort of like transplants of institutional models or practices from the West. So you would see, like, you know, the building of museums would still follow similar kinds of like templates and models that have been established for the past 150 years or 200 years, for example. The discourse is still sort of like, and the practice is still sort of like centered on a very set list of sort of like conventions, like you know, public engagement, public programs, exhibition centered, that kind of stuff. And even how artists work, you know, you used to primarily have to go through art school to be recognized. People still ask which art school you want, and increasingly curators too, right? The role of the curator. So concretized into a position of not just power but also professionalism. So what happens that curators even have schools that they need to attend, networks that they need to sort of build, conferences or events, or that they need to sort of like be seen at biennales, that they need to show face at in order to establish some form of credibility. These are indications of an industry, yeah. So because these are sort of replicated on a mass scale. When it's an industry, for bookkeeping purposes, for economic sort of in terms of economic legibility, of course it sounds good lah. You know, money trickles in, and money trickles down on some level to certain people, not all the way down. But there is, of course, healthy, vibrant sort of like things that seem to be happening. So there's an economy, if not of monetary sort of like, not of sort of like equal monetary reward for every single sort of like stakeholder. There is an economy of appearance that seems to suggest that there's this critical density of you know, activities and events happening. So on that level it's good. But if you think of it as an industry, then it really sort of creates certain kinds of like standards, norms, not always sort of like comfortable for artists who are quite individualistic, right, in their sentiment, in their thinking, in their approach to life. I wouldn't go so far as to say that it's a regression back into a period in which artists were seen solely as craftsmen. Nevertheless, the system of patronage has never really, by and large, changed very much over the years, you know. Although having said that, of course, there were attempts to sort of create new experiment with new economic models, such as, you know, Buku Jalanan. They were creating like, they were setting up a koperasi to really sort of mount and challenge this government sort of like idea of what creative economy is supposed to be, that is centered on this sort of artist as entrepreneur figure, right? They were trying to sort of like brand the artist as the entrepreneurial sort of like figure who is able to sort of like shape his own destiny and all that kind of nonsense lah that that the creative economy tends to want people to buy into their narrative, that very neoliberal narrative, right, of the self-made man. But there are other artists who are challenging this sort of like approach and thinking. So there are always spaces within the art to sort of submit every single claim to rigorous scrutiny. And I think that is the most valuable kinds of like spaces that we have. So I'm working on a project for next year for the Dhaka Art Summit. So it requires me to do a bit of research about the King of Hawaii's 19th century travel across the Pacific Rim. So in the 19th century, when America was invading and trying to encroach into the territorial sovereignty of Hawaii, the island of Hawaii, the last king of Hawaii embarked on this sort of like world tour. And so he visited like the Chinese in San Francisco, he visited the Japanese emperor, he visited the king of Siam, he visited the Sultan of Johor, and in each of these stops he had expressed interest in establishing a pan-Malayan or pan-Malayo-Polynesian confederation, which is a new nation that is based on this idea of bringing together all the island groups around this part of the world to make a stand against like all these sort of colonial intrusions. I could sort of go two ways with this project. One is to write an academic paper about it. The other is to sort of maybe turn it into an exhibition, of which I'm not necessarily a curator, but in some ways kind of like more fluidly playing the role of, I don't know, either an artist or a producer or a director on some level. So what I'm doing is next month I'm going to the Philippines. I'm working with the craftsmen in this particular village that makes religious statuary. But they also make dioramas for museums in the Philippines as well as in Singapore. So they're well known for their dioramas as well. What I'm going to do is get them to work with them, collaborate with them on this project where we're going to sort of visualize this story through a diorama. And this will be presented in the summit that's coming up in February next year. Why I chose that approach is that it allows for some kind of collaboration to happen. Cannot sort of conceive, if I were to be an artist, a practice that is not collaborative in nature. So maybe that is the gist and the heart of how I want to sort of like think the artwork, or maybe certain parts of the artwork can be moving towards to in the future. So less focus on the notion of authorship or the single artistic genius, or the artist who has that angst or that kind of or a certain sort of very individualistic worldview that he or she can only sort of like express. Maybe that's one aspect of it that is worth exploring, given that we live in such conformist society. But the other part of the equation is also to think of how art can be a collaborative sort of platform. I don't know if a lot of artists even sort of engage with this idea of decoloniality, only because the entire sort of like institution, the structure in which art is being sort of like produced, disseminated, circulated, and discussed on are basically inheritance of our colonial past. Yeah, nothing much has sort of like changed. You change a white person with a brown person, but still within that whole sort of like same structure. It's the same. You're just sort of like repeating that cycle of institutional sort of injustice that has been in place since the colonial period. Nothing has changed. That brown person, that having a brown person on top doesn't guarantee that person would not subjugate or replicate the whole systemic kind of like violence that was previously already in place. Yeah, that's why our country is so fucked up. We don't talk about decoloniality enough.
Yeah. Do you think we still kind of colonized that?
Yeah, we are in a neo-colonial phase because all our leaders are basically groomed in the tradition of a colonial mentality, of a colonial sort of like frame of mind. They still believe in certain kinds of concepts of power, entrenched concepts of power, that they're refusing to sort of like let go, just because it secures them certain kinds of like position within society. I mean, that will always change. I mean, institutions are flexible enough in terms of how it will sooner or later absorb them as art. That's not a problem, yeah. But the problem is, why do you need the institution to recognize your work as art? Who cares about the institution? I guess it sort of guarantees at least some kind of economic success, as well as certain forms of cultural prestige. But if that is what you're only working towards, that sort of very transient form of recognition, then yeah, I guess I don't know. I mean, that's not the type of artistic practice that I'm interested in. I'm interested in looking at urban history through architecture, primarily migrant settlements. So I'm fascinated by migrant ecologies, how certain forms of religiosity plays out in, say, temple architectures of a working class community like Klang, and how it facilitates a kind of transcultural bond between the Javanese and the Chinese migrant workers over a period of 20th century. How that happens through a house temple, for example, is what I'm curious. So it's more to also then expand the scope of what we think of as art and art history, right? Because art history historically has always been a very broad and interdisciplinary kind of field of inquiry. And that is perhaps why I was attracted to it. It allowed you to sort of think about cultural practices, histories, with a visual dimension that that are outside of cultural institutions. So as a disciplinary sort of like field, it's quite wide in terms of its scope. For me, it's important to sort of continue to sort of recognize that, because increasingly, even here, we tend to sort of think of art history as solely, and also in the West actually, art history as solely the history of either contemporary art, contemporary or modern art. These are the only two fields that are, or the history of sort of like Western art, but through very sort of like specific lens. So recognizing artists, you know, artworks. This idea of the fine art is still very strong, as much as artists have continuously sort of like pushed or resisted against this categorization. The idea of the fine art continues to hold sway. Even a Dada artwork, when sort of like installed in the MoMA retrospective, unavoidably it is sanctified as a fine art practice, as much as it is about a process of de-skilling that was really pushing back against the idea of the fine art.